They were already pulling them apart when the foal stopped. In the dust of a Texas auction yard, his small body pressed against his mother's flank, refusing every tug forward. Hooves scraped, voices faded, and something unseen began to shift. In that pause, before anyone understood why, the room started to listen. The dust didn't rise all at once. It settled in layers, drifting slowly over the auction yard like something that had been there long before the people arrived. Marla Bennett stood just beyond the rail, one hand resting lightly on the sun-warmed wood. She had chosen this spot carefully, close enough to observe, far enough not to interfere. At 63, she had learned that most things revealed themselves if you gave them space. The morning light stretched low across the Amarillo yard, catching the edges of metal gates and worn leather halters. Horses moved in small, restless patterns behind the fencing, some pacing, some still, some watching with the quiet alertness that never quite left them. The air carried the scent of hay, dust, and something older, a kind of fatigue that settled into the ground itself. Marla wasn't here to buy. She had told herself that before she left the house, before the long drive across the open plains, before the first glimpse of the trailers lined up like a procession of unspoken stories. She was here to take notes, to observe intake conditions for a regional sanctuary. To witness, not to act. That had always been the rule. A handler moved along the line of pens, clipboard tucked under his arm, calling out numbers in a steady, practiced rhythm. Gates clanged open and shut. Horses were shifted, sorted, grouped. Efficiency had its own language here, one that didn't pause for hesitation. Marla's gaze drifted across the pens until it settled on a pair near the far end. The mare stood slightly apart from the others, not by force, but by presence. A bay coat dulled by travel, her frame lean but not broken, her posture steady in a way that didn't demand attention, yet held it anyway. There was no panic in her, no wasted movement, just a quiet, contained awareness. Beside her, pressed so close it was almost difficult to see where one ended and the other began, was a foal. He was small, younger than most brought through auctions like this. His legs still carried that uncertain length, not yet grown into themselves. His coat held a softer sheen, untouched by the harsher wear of time. But it wasn't his size that caught Marla's attention. It was the way he positioned himself. Not wandering, not testing the edges of the pen the way young horses often did. He remained at the mare's shoulder, adjusting his stance with hers, matching each subtle shift, as though tethered by something unseen. When she lowered her head, he angled his body inward. When she stilled, he stilled. Marla leaned forward slightly, narrowing her focus. There was no rope between them, and yet nothing about their proximity felt accidental. A gust of wind moved through the yard, lifting strands of the mare's mane. The foal flicked his ears, pressed closer. The movement was small, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but it carried a kind of insistence. Marla had seen bonded pairs before, mares and foals, companions from pasture life, even older horses that had learned to move as one over years of shared ground. But something here felt tighter, not fragile, not desperate, just unyielding. Behind her, voices rose and fell, buyers discussing weight, age, condition. Numbers were exchanged with the kind of detachment that made everything seem smaller than it was. Marla let the sound pass through her without holding on to it. Her attention stayed fixed on the pair. The handler reached their pen. "Let's move 'em," he called, unlatching the gate with a quick, practiced motion. The mare lifted her head, not sharply, not in alarm, just enough to register the change. The foal mirrored her instantly, his body angling closer still, shoulder pressing against her side. The gate swung open with a hollow metallic echo. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the space shifted. The handler stepped in, guiding the movement with subtle pressure, expecting the usual response, horses flowing forward, following the path set before them. It was how this place worked. Predictable, controlled. The mare took a step. The foal followed, but not forward. He moved sideways, adjusting himself to remain exactly where he had been, his small frame closing the gap the mare's step had created. Marla's fingers tightened slightly against the rail. It was a simple correction, a minor adjustment, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. But it interrupted the flow. The handler paused, just briefly, recalibrating. "Come on now," he muttered, applying a bit more pressure, guiding the mare toward the open space. Again the mare responded, steady, compliant. And again the foal refused the direction, not with force, not with panic, just with presence. He leaned into her, grounding himself in that single point of contact as if the rest of the world didn't exist beyond it. A few heads in the crowd turned. Marla felt it before she saw it, the subtle shift in attention, the way the air changed when something didn't behave as expected. She exhaled slowly, eyes never leaving the pair. This wasn't resistance, not in the way people understood it. It was something quieter, and far more difficult to move. The handler stepped back for a second, studying them now instead of directing. Behind him another gate clanged open, horses moved, voices continued, but around this pen the rhythm had slipped just slightly, enough to be felt. Marla straightened, a thought forming at the edge of her awareness, not yet clear, but impossible to ignore. If they tried again, if they pushed harder, the moment would change, and once it changed, it wouldn't come back the same. She didn't move, didn't speak. Not yet, but her focus sharpened, drawn fully into the space between that mare and the small, unmoving line the foal had drawn beside her. Something was about to be tested, and not everyone in the yard understood what that meant. Cole Ransom had seen hesitation before. It came in many forms, stubborn geldings planting their weight into the dirt, nervous mares circling tight, young colts testing the edges of a handler's patience. Most of it could be worked through with timing, pressure, and a steady hand. The system relied on that predictability. But this was different. He stepped back into the pen, boots grinding softly against the packed earth, eyes fixed on the pair. The mare stood quiet, her breathing even, her ears turning, not pinned, not alarmed, just aware. The foal remained close enough that his shoulder brushed her ribs with each small shift. Cole adjusted his grip on the lead rope, angling his body to create a clearer path forward. He didn't rush. There was no need for that. A controlled movement, a gentle suggestion of direction, that was usually enough. "Easy now," he said, more to himself than to them. He guided the mare again. She responded without resistance, stepping forward into the space he opened for her. A clean, cooperative movement. Exactly what he expected. But the foal broke the line. Instead of following through, he pivoted, cutting across the mare's path just enough to return to her side, not blocking her, not resisting outright, just correcting the distance. Cole exhaled through his nose. "All right," he muttered, quieter this time. Outside the pen, a few more people had turned to watch. Not many, just enough to register that something wasn't moving as smoothly as it should. Conversation softened, not out of concern, but out of curiosity. Marla felt it ripple through the crowd, that subtle shift where observation replaced assumption. She moved a step closer to the rail. Juniper's ears flicked back and forth, catching sounds, processing movement, but his body never drifted far from Rosemary. Each time the mare adjusted, he closed the space again, pressing himself into alignment with her, as though guided by something deeper than instinct alone. There was no panic in him, no frantic energy. Just a steady refusal to exist anywhere else. Cole tried a different angle, stepping slightly to the side to separate their paths. It was a common technique: create space, break the pattern, allow each horse to move independently. The mare stepped forward again, obedient to the pressure. For a fraction of a second, there was distance. Then the foal moved. Quick, faster than before, but not wild. A precise shift, almost practiced. He slid back into place beside her, shoulder to flank, restoring the line he refused to let break. A murmur passed through the watchers, not loud, not disruptive, just enough to acknowledge that this wasn't routine. Marla's hand tightened slightly on the rail. She wasn't thinking about notes anymore, not about intake conditions or transport schedules. Her focus had narrowed to the space inside that pen, to the quiet insistence of something that didn't belong to the rhythm of this place. Cole straightened, rolling his shoulders once as he reassessed. "Let's give him a second," someone called from behind the fence. He didn't respond, but he heard it. He also knew time wasn't something the yard offered freely. Every delay pushed against the schedule, against the flow that kept everything moving. Efficiency mattered here. Still, He paused. Juniper shifted his weight, pressing closer into Rosemary's side, his small frame fitting against her like it had been measured there. His breathing matched hers now, slow, steady, anchored. The mare lowered her head slightly, brushing her muzzle along the foal's neck in a brief, almost absent gesture. Not a signal to move, not a cue to separate, just contact. Cole watched it happen. He had handled enough horses to recognize agitation, fear, resistance. This wasn't any of those. The mare wasn't holding him back. She wasn't bracing, wasn't pulling away from the handler's direction. If anything, she was allowing the movement. But the foal was choosing otherwise. Another attempt. Cole stepped in again, this time with a bit more clarity in his direction, guiding the mare forward with a firmer hand. Not forceful, just more defined. The mare complied. Her hoof lifted, pressed into the dirt, carried her forward. And for the first time, the foal didn't immediately follow. There was a breath of space between them, a narrow line. Juniper froze. Not out of confusion, but as if measuring something. His ears tilted forward, his body angled, his weight balanced on the edge of a decision. Then, slowly, he stepped. Not forward, back. One step, small, deliberate, reclaiming the space he had lost. The movement was so subtle it barely registered in the noise of the yard, but the effect was immediate. The line reset. Cole stopped. He didn't speak this time. Around them, the background noise continued, other horses moving, numbers being called, gates opening and closing. But it felt farther away now, less immediate, like it belonged to a different space entirely. Marla exhaled quietly. This wasn't about control anymore. It wasn't even about the process. There was a boundary here, one that hadn't been drawn by fences or ropes or human intention, and the foal was holding it. Cole shifted his stance, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the pair. He could push harder. He could break the pattern, force the separation, restore the order the yard depended on. That was always an option. But standing there, watching the foal settle back into place, something about that option felt heavier than it should have. He let the rope slacken just a fraction. Juniper didn't move. Neither did the mare. For a moment, the three of them existed in a kind of suspended space. No forward motion, no retreat, just the quiet weight of a choice that hadn't yet been made. Beyond the rail, Marla felt her attention sharpen into something else entirely. Not observation, not curiosity. Something closer to understanding. Because if they tried again, if they insisted on breaking that line, it wouldn't just be the foal that resisted. A truck rumbled somewhere beyond the fencing, its engine cutting through the air for a moment before fading again into the distance. The rest of the yard continued on, but around that pen something had slowed, like time had lost its urgency. Cole didn't step forward this time. He stayed where he was, the rope loose in his hand, watching. Juniper shifted slightly, adjusting his stance against Rosemary's side, his small frame rising and falling with her breath. There was no strain in him now, no sign of resistance building, just that same steady presence, anchored, unwavering. The mare lowered her head again, not toward the ground, not toward the handler, toward the foal. Her muzzle brushed along the curve of his neck, slower than before, deliberate in a way that drew the eye. Juniper stilled completely beneath the contact, ears flicking once before settling. The gesture lasted only a few seconds, but it held. Marla felt it before she understood it, the shift, subtle but unmistakable. Not in movement, but in intention. She stepped closer without realizing it, her hand leaving the rail. Cole noticed. His gaze flicked briefly toward her, then back to the horses. He didn't say anything, didn't ask her to step back. The usual boundaries seemed less defined now. Rosemary lifted her head. For a moment, she looked straight ahead, past the open gate, past the handler, toward the space beyond the pen. Her ears turned forward, catching something distant. Then, slowly, she turned, not toward the exit, toward Marla. It wasn't abrupt. There was no tension in it, just a gradual redirection, as if the mare had recalculated the space around her and chosen a different point to settle her attention. Juniper followed the shift instantly, pivoting with her, keeping that same contact intact. Marla froze. There was no reason for it, no signal she could identify, no pattern she could name, but the focus of the moment had moved. It was no longer centered on the gate or the process, or the next step in the auction flow. It had narrowed to her. She swallowed, steadying her breath. "I'm just observing," she murmured under her breath, as if saying it aloud might anchor her back into the role she had come here to play. But the words felt thin. Rosemary took a step. Not forward into the open path Cole had created, sideways, toward Marla. The movement was small, almost hesitant, but it carried weight. Juniper stayed pressed against her, adjusting with that same precise alignment, his hooves finding ground exactly where hers had been. Cole straightened slightly. "Hold on," he said, not loudly, but enough to signal that something was changing. No one moved. The few people who had gathered near the pen leaned in, their earlier curiosity now replaced with a quiet attention that didn't need explanation. Conversations had faded entirely. Even the distant sounds of the yard seemed to recede, as if pulled back from the edge of this moment. Marla didn't step back. She couldn't, not because she felt trapped, but because something in the mare's approach didn't allow for retreat. It wasn't pressure, it wasn't dominance, it was trust. Or something that looked like it. Rosemary stopped a few feet away, close enough that Marla could see the fine lines along her face. The dust settled into the folds of her coat, the calm steadiness in her eyes. There was no fear there, no confusion, just presence. Juniper shifted once, pressing closer into her shoulder, then stilling again. Marla let out a slow breath. Her hands stayed at her sides. She didn't reach forward, didn't try to bridge the space. Every instinct she had, every lesson from years of watching, learning, understanding, told her that this wasn't a moment to act. It was a moment to receive. Rosemary lowered her head again, but this time the movement wasn't toward the foal. It angled slightly, just enough to bring Juniper forward into the space between them. The contact broke. Not fully, but enough. Juniper hesitated. It was the first true hesitation Marla had seen from him. His body paused mid-shift, his weight caught between where he had been and where the mare's movement had guided him. His ears flicked, his gaze shifting, not away from Rosemary, but outward, uncertain for the first time. The space opened. Small, fragile, real. Marla felt her chest tighten. Around them, no one spoke. Cole didn't move. The rope in his hand hung loose, forgotten. The yard had come to a standstill, not by force, but by attention. Juniper took a half-step forward, then stopped. His body angled back toward Rosemary, as if ready to close the distance again at any second. Rosemary didn't follow. She remained where she was, her head still lowered slightly, her body steady, her gaze resting, not on the foal this time, but on Marla. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a request. It was something quieter than that, a permission, or maybe a question. Marla felt it settle into her, heavier than anything she had expected to carry that morning. This wasn't about moving horses anymore. It wasn't about process or timing or the steady rhythm of an auction yard that didn't wait for moments like this. It was about what happened when that rhythm was interrupted, and whether anyone was willing to listen to what filled the silence. Juniper shifted again, his small body caught between instinct and something new, something uncertain. The space between them remained, and for the first time since the gate had opened, no one tried to close it. A distant clang of metal echoed from another pen, but it felt out of place here, like it belonged to a different world that hadn't yet noticed this one had paused. Marla became aware of her own breathing, slow, measured, careful not to disturb what stood in front of her. Juniper hovered between them, his small body angled back toward Rosemary, yet held forward by something he didn't fully understand. His weight shifted from one hoof to the other, uncertain but not afraid. Rosemary didn't step closer. She didn't retreat. She simply waited. Cole let out a quiet breath and lowered his gaze for a moment, the rope in his hand slack, forgotten. He had spent years moving animals through spaces like this, guiding them from one point to another with efficiency that left little room for interpretation. But standing here now, he found himself outside that rhythm. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady, but stripped of its earlier certainty. "You know this isn't how we usually do things." Marla nodded without looking at him. "I know." Her voice carried no resistance, just acknowledgement. She stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, closing part of the distance that Rosemary had left open. Not all of it, just enough to meet the moment without overwhelming it. Juniper's ears flicked toward her, then back to Rosemary. His body tightened for a fraction of a second, as if preparing to retreat. But he didn't move. Marla stopped where she was. She didn't reach out. Instead, she lowered her posture slightly, softening her presence, allowing the space to remain open rather than filled. It was a small adjustment, but one that spoke in a language the horses understood better than any words. The mare's gaze remained steady, not fixed in demand, not urging, simply present. Behind them, a few of the onlookers shifted, their earlier murmurs gone. One man removed his hat, holding it loosely at his side without seeming to realize he had done so. Another leaned against the rail, his arms no longer crossed. The yard had not stopped. But here something else had taken hold. Cole glanced toward the gate, then back to the pair, then to Marla. He knew what should happen next. The process was clear, defined, practiced. But clarity didn't make the decision easier. He stepped closer, stopping just outside the immediate space the three of them had created. "If they go through," he said quietly, "they'll be listed separate, different buyers most likely." The words hung in the air, not as a warning, not as pressure, but as fact. Marla closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had come here to observe, to document, to step back. But standing here now, with the foal suspended between instinct and invitation, and the mare holding that fragile line without force, observation felt incomplete. She opened her eyes. "Is there a way to keep them together?" she asked. Cole hesitated. "There's always a way," he said finally. "It's just not always simple." Marla nodded once. "Simple isn't what this is." Juniper shifted again, taking a small step forward, closer now to Marla than he had been before. His head lowered slightly, not in submission, but in consideration. The space between him and Rosemary remained, but it no longer felt like separation. It felt held. Marla reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. The movement was slow, careful, not breaking the line of connection. She scrolled briefly, then lifted it to her ear. "Nadia," she said when the call connected, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm at the Amarillo yard. I need to ask you something." A pause. Then she listened. Around her, no one spoke. The few people who had gathered didn't step closer, didn't interrupt. They simply stayed, as if they understood that whatever came next would matter beyond this moment. "Yes," Marla continued, "a mare and foal. They haven't been separated yet, but they will be." Another pause. She glanced at Cole, then back at Rosemary. "I don't think they should be." Cole shifted his weight, but he didn't interrupt. The wind moved lightly through the yard, lifting strands of hair, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant hay. It softened the edges of the moment, but didn't break it. Marla lowered the phone slightly, listening again, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what we need." She ended the call and looked up. "There's a sanctuary," she said to Cole. "They can take both, together." Cole let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It'll take coordination," he said. "Paperwork, payment, timing. I'll help with that." The words came without hesitation. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Cole nodded. "All right," he said. "We can hold them. Give you time to set it up." The decision didn't come with a signal. No announcement, no shift in the broader rhythm of the yard. But within that pen, something settled. Juniper took another small step forward, then stopped, his body still angled toward Rosemary. The connection between them hadn't broken. It had simply stretched, widened, allowed something else to exist within it. Marla lowered her gaze slightly, letting the space remain open, unforced. Rosemary lifted her head just enough to take in the full scene. Marla, Cole, the quiet line of people beyond the rail. Then she exhaled. A slow, steady release. Not relief, not tension, something in between. Around them the yard began to move again, subtly at first, then more fully, as if the pause had reached its natural end, but for those who had witnessed it, the rhythm didn't feel quite the same. Marla stepped back just enough to give the horses space again. She didn't need to stay close anymore. The choice had been made. And yet, as the first sounds of the auction returned, voices rising, gaits shifting, hooves moving across dirt, there was a quiet understanding that followed them. Not everything here would move the way it had before, and some lines, once seen clearly, could no longer be crossed without consequence. By late afternoon, the light had softened into something warmer, stretching long across the open land beyond the yard. The edges of the world felt less defined there. Fences gave way to distance, and distance gave way to sky. The trailer ride had been quiet. Juniper had stayed close the entire time, adjusting with every subtle shift of Rosemary's stance as the road moved beneath them. There had been no panic, no restless circling. Just that same quiet alignment, carried forward into a new place neither of them had known before. When the trailer door opened, the air was different, cooler, cleaner. It carried the scent of grass instead of dust. Marla stood off to the side as the ramp was lowered, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She hadn't spoken much on the drive. There hadn't been anything to say that would add to what had already happened. Nadia Wells stepped forward first, her movements calm, unhurried. She had done this many times before. Welcoming horses into spaces meant not just for holding, but for beginning again. "Take your time," she said softly, though the words were more for the people than the animals. Cole guided the lead gently, giving Rosemary the choice to step forward when she was ready. For a moment she didn't move. Juniper shifted slightly behind her, pressing into the familiar line of her body, waiting. Then, slowly, Rosemary stepped down. One hoof, then the next, feeling the ground beneath her before committing her weight. The motion was careful, but not hesitant, measured. Juniper followed immediately, his smaller hooves finding the ramp with a quick, precise rhythm. When he reached the ground, he paused, just for a second, taking in the space around him. It stretched wide, no tight fencing, no constant noise, just open pasture rolling out beneath a sky that seemed larger than the one they had left behind. He took a few steps forward, then stopped. His head turned, searching. Rosemary stepped beside him, her presence steady as ever. The distance between them remained small, no longer pressed together as tightly as before, but never fully apart. Marla watched from a distance, her chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm that finally felt like her own again. Nadia moved quietly to her side. "They'll need time," she said. Marla nodded. "I think they already have it," she replied. In the pasture, Juniper lowered his head, nosing at the grass with cautious curiosity. It wasn't the hurried, uncertain movement of a foal trying to understand something unfamiliar. It was slower, considered. He took a step farther from Rosemary. Another. The space widened, not forced, allowed. He paused again, then turned back, closing the distance with a few quick strides until his shoulder brushed against her once more. The pattern held, outward, back, testing, returning. Rosemary didn't follow him each time. She remained where she was, her body relaxed now in a way that hadn't been possible in the yard. But her attention never left him. Each movement he made, she registered. Each return she accepted without shift or strain. Marla exhaled softly. Behind her, the sounds of the sanctuary settled into a quieter rhythm, other horses moving in distant paddocks, the low rustle of wind through grass, the occasional creak of wood and wire. It wasn't silent, but it was different. It didn't demand anything. Cole stood a few steps away, hands resting on his hips as he looked out over the pasture. "Not a bad place," he said, almost to himself. Marla glanced at him. "No," she said, "it isn't." He nodded once, then shifted his weight. "You don't see that every day," he added after a moment. Marla followed his gaze back to the pair. Juniper had moved a little farther this time, his steps more confident now, his head lifting to take in the horizon before him. For a second he stood still, framed against the wide stretch of land, as if something inside him had expanded to meet it. Then, as if remembering, he turned and trotted back. Always back. Marla smiled faintly, though the expression carried more weight than ease. "They didn't need to be taught anything," she said. "We just needed to not interrupt it." Cole didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Yeah," he said, "maybe that's the part we forget." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pasture. The light softened the lines of everything it touched: fence posts, distant hills, the quiet figures of horses moving through open space. Juniper settled beside Rosemary again, this time without urgency, his body relaxed, his breathing even. The tension that had once defined every inch of his movement had eased into something steadier. Not dependence, not separation, something in between. Marla turned to leave, her steps slow, unhurried. She didn't need to stay. The moment that had brought her here had already unfolded into something complete. But before she reached the gate, she paused. Behind her, Juniper lifted his head. For a brief second, his gaze followed her, not with the intensity of before, not with the need to hold or resist, but with a quiet recognition. Then he turned back to Rosemary, and the two of them stood there, framed by open land and fading light, held together not by pressure or fear, but by something that had been allowed to remain intact. Marla stepped through the gate and into the quiet beyond. The story didn't end there. It didn't need to. Because sometimes what matters most isn't what changes, but what is given the chance to stay. Sometimes the most powerful choice isn't to act, but to pause and recognize what already exists. This story reminds us that bonds, when honored, not broken, can shape better outcomes than force ever could. If this moment stayed with you, there are more stories ahead that explore the quiet ways horses change the way we see the world.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below and follow Horse Heart Healing for more stories like this.